Hey there folks, the number one Phish hater from the Infinite Jukebox here with another entry in my Rock Hall Reviews series for 2025. What is the Rock Hall Review series, you may be asking? It's a yearly series that I do on this channel where I talk about each of the current year's Rock and Roll Hall of Fame nominees, review one album by each of them, and then talk about if I think they should get into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and if I think they will get into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Two questions that more frequently than you would ever really want have very different answers. And today I am talking about easily my least favorite nominee on the list this year by far, just like on a personal level, Phish, and their big quotations around this following word, classic 1992 studio album, A Picture of Nectar. I know that some people will probably want me to cover a live album instead, but I don't really do live albums on this channel for the most part, so A Picture of Nectar just seemed like the right direction to go in. God, I fucking hate this band so much. I think that almost every generation has to have some sort of band with a niche but hugely passionate, almost to an obnoxious extent, extremely loud fan base with a group of people that just obsess over them for the rest of their lives. I mean, the Woodstock generation obviously had the Grateful Dead, among others, and hey, even my generation now has bands like King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard, for example. And you know what? There's nothing wrong with that. And for a certain brand of dork on the fringes of popular culture, it's almost a rite of passage to get overly enthused by a band within that vein of music. Unfortunately, the 80s and 90s had Phish. Those poor, poor souls. If you can't tell, I'm not the biggest Phish fan. I consider them a wildly boring and at times beyond self-indulgent band that has never really tickled my fancy, to put it nicely. I mean, I revisit Phish now and again thinking, hey, maybe I'll hop on the Phish train, maybe I'll eat the Phish food this time, but man, going back to A Picture of Nectar, this sucks. This still sucks bad. I listened to this album once years ago, didn't like it then, don't like it now. This is, in my eyes, music with no guts or edge in any way whatsoever. Musical masturbation at its core, while trying to pretend like it's something airier and easier to digest than it really is. I mean, when you talk about bands that are self-indulgent, you more than likely are probably thinking of prog bands that you don't like, or maybe some longer, kind of more enthusiastically extensive metal bands within the realm of doom metal or stoner metal, but to me, Phish almost kind of personify the type of band that kind of come across like what they're doing is absolute genius when it's the most mediocre music you've heard in your life, with it feeling too self-indulgent to be memorable and too polished for it to ever really feel raw or authentic in any way. Not to say that this is a group of musicians that don't like the music that they play, I'm not saying that whatsoever, but it really does feel like this album is just nothing in a sense. It's not memorable in any way, and a lot of the time it just feels way too cleaned up for it to feel like an impassioned performance from in the studio. And I feel the same way about them live too, so don't go in the comments telling me to listen to a live album instead. I don't like those either. I mean, musically, Phish are obviously a very technically proficient band, and I could never hate on them from that particular perspective, but at the same time, a lot of this record just feels directionless to me. I mean, they bounce around all of these ideas ranging from jazz to country, creating this illusion of versatility, but at the end of the day, at the core of each of these individual songs is the same circle jerking of jazz-based jam band sounds that they never really switch up, and I feel like some people tend to perceive them as this band that are kind of a jack-of-all-trades sort of act, when in reality I think that they only have one trick, really, which is just jamming on whatever sound they kind of feel like, not adding much to it, not delivering much that makes it stand out from other artists that more singularly dabble in those particular realms of music, and then are pretty easily forgotten about thereafter. This is exactly how I feel about most of Phish's discography, to clarify, including A Picture of Nectar. All of the various genres on display here only really serving as an attempt to convince me that A Picture of Nectar is more than nothing, but I just feel nothing. This record gives me no emotion. It feels soulless, it feels lifeless, it feels flat, it feels dull. It tries to convince you that it has some sort of ambition, but it feels like it completely lacks ambition at the same time, despite the jumping around of genres, and the bloated beyond belief runtime makes me wish I was listening to literally any other studio jam band. And that's saying a lot, because most jam bands in the studio are not that valuable compared to their live performances. But Phish do an amazing thing by making me care about neither. So credit where credit's due there, I guess. But this is boring shit to me, man. I really don't have a lot to say about it. I just despise Phish as a band, and I'm sorry if there are any Phish food lovers out there in the audience who really deeply care about this band. I'm sure that I will get some Phish fans in the comments like, you just don't get it, man. But, you know, I can't stand it. And I think it's fitting that this record has a song called Chalk Dust Torture, because despite the versatility on display, this album does have all of the personality of Chalk Dust, and it does feel like torture to listen to front to back. So I appreciate the self-awareness there, albeit unintentional. So this record has that going for it, at least. I'm going to give this record 1.5 stars out of 5, and that's me being kind of generous to not only this record, but Phish as a band in general. So do I think Phish deserve to get into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, to be enshrined alongside the likes of the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and Chuck Berry and Radiohead and all of the most influential musicians of all time? No, of course not. I will say, I don't think Phish are a band without their merit for induction, because if you want to take some of the most notable qualities of Phish's legacy, like the cult fan base or the constant change-up of stylistic and compositional decisions in the middle of shows, and remove those from their legacy, then I feel like you can't make a case for, like, the Grateful Dead getting in, or more recently, Dave Matthews Band getting in, the former of which absolutely deserves it, the latter of which, But either way, I feel like there are a fair amount of bands that have similar qualifications to Phish that have gotten in or deserve to be in, so I can't really fully hate on Phish in terms of them being a contender for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, but at the same time, I don't think they deserve it still. I mean, sure, they are arguably the definitive post-Deadhead jam band that carried on that legacy in their own way. Sure, Dave Matthews Band were more commercially successful and more mainstream, but I feel like Phish had much more of the late 60s counterculture, hippie kind of Woodstock spirit that the Dead originally held and, you know, continued to hold until the passing of Jerry Garcia. And in that sense, I can respect what Phish have done and what they have continuously done over the course of their careers, but with that in mind, I also don't think they really have that much influence or impact. I see a lot of people cite them as a band that completely reformed what the idea of a jam band was, but I don't know, man. There's a lot of modern jam bands out there, like Goose and Disco Biscuits, for example, that a lot of people say wouldn't exist without Phish, but I don't know, I think they absolutely would. The jam band revivalist explosion of the late 80s and early 90s would have occurred with or without Phish, I'm sure, and it would have sucked just as much, maybe even a little less without them, if I'm being completely honest. And without that, they don't have that much of a legacy. They have a cult fan base, and that's it. And while I don't necessarily think that they are the worst nominee the Rock Hall has ever picked, hell, I don't even think that they're the worst nominee this year, I also kind of think that it's just a strange pick considering, I don't know, what do they have to show, really, overall? A really diehard fan base, a massive discography of studio and live records, and some admitted, you know, critical appreciation over the time, and that's kinda it. I don't really see music history being that wildly different without them. Now, do I think Phish will get into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame? I think that's honestly a much more interesting question, because I honestly don't know. If you had just asked me a few years ago if Phish were nominated a few years ago, will Phish get into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame? I would have said no. No shot. Absolutely not. No chance. Snowball's chance in hell of that happening. But with that being said, the recent induction of Dave Matthews Band kind of goes to show that the Hall at least seemingly cares about the idea of pleasing diehard cult fan bases of bands, in that case jam bands, by inducting them, no matter how deserving that they are. And I'm not saying that the Hall are going to be inducting Blues Traveler or the Spin Doctors in the next few years, because I think that those bands are too kind of specific and, you know, too small, for lack of a better term, even by the Hall's pretty low standards for the nominees this year. But Phish are kind of the other band, when you talk about jam bands, that really have that diehard fan base that everyone is kind of aware of, even if you aren't really necessarily a fan. And in that sense, I think the Hall might actually be at least slightly interested in coming back to them in the future. But I say that because I don't think they're going to get in this year. There are too many massive nominees between the critical darlings, which Phish never always really were, between the commercial titans, which Phish, again, really never were outside of live shows, certainly not in the studio at the very least, that I just can't see it happening this year. I mean, there are some nominees that I think Phish do have a better shot than, mainly Mana, but at the same time, do you really see Phish getting in over, like, Soundgarden and Oasis and Mariah Carey? Not saying that they're locks either, but do you see Phish getting in over them? No, absolutely not. But I honestly do think that they might get in the future. And you know what? Good for them. And good for their fan base, because I just dislike their music too much to have any sort of non-biased historical opinion on them. But as it stands, maybe Dave Matthews Band's induction will kick off a series of jam band inductions, in the same way that Rush's induction kicked off a series of prog inductions over a decade ago at this point that ended just a couple years after. So I feel like maybe a Phish induction in a year or two would maybe fall in line with the Hall has done in the past, having a brief string of artists in a specific niche genre or realm of musical appreciation that gets in and kind of satiates a specific corner of music nerdness to kind of calm down about their favorite bands not being in the Hall. Not totally, but to a decent extent at least. And, you know, like I said, I don't necessarily think they're the worst pick in the world, but I don't think that they're a good pick either, at least not at this point in the Hall's history. And maybe they'll get in within the next couple of years. I highly doubt that it'll be this year, though. In fact, I would argue they are one of the least likely inductees possible for this year of nominees. Maybe even the second least likely overall. With that being said, that is the end of this entry in the Rock Hall Reviews series for 2025. Thank you for watching the Infinite Jukebox, and I'll see you in the next one.